Hello, everyone. It's me again. If you were in my last talk, it's funny now. There's like people cleaning the window behind me, so like very distracting. You can see them somewhere right there. Yeah, cool. So welcome to migrating your app to Flutter. This is, I've been giving a lot of introduction to Flutter talks, and so I said, what's the next evolution? I think I've like given like 100 introduction to Flutter. So how do I talk more about what to do next? You've learned Flutter or you're learning Flutter. How do I now take my existing Android and iOS app and convert it to a Flutter app? And this talk really comes from this customer, this client that came to me. And the client said to me, Faisal, you have 2 months to port my Android and iOS app to React Native, right? And I said, well, I'm not going to port it to React Native. I'll do it to Flutter. And he said, okay, well, whatever, just get it done in 2 months. And that was a challenge because the trouble was that the app itself was very complex, right? It is a big coffee app, and it needs there's a lot of business logic, it has a lot of UI, and so getting it done in 2 months seemed almost impossible. So I broke down a bunch of strategies, and that's what I'm going to go over. So who am I? I'm a Google developer expert. I'm a co-founder of Irene, which is a simple modern cremation platform, and I'm a CTO at Bitstrap, which is a consulting company where I do machine learning as well as mobile development. I'm just distracted by these people like cleaning behind me. Okay, so before I start, I want to just tell you guys a story, right, of where Flutter came from, because I think it's very important to understand where Flutter came from and what the motivations of Flutter are, and to get more intuitive understanding of like how Flutter works. If you were in my last talk, I talked about getting an intuitive understanding of machine learning. I think it's the same thing about getting an intuitive understanding in Flutter. If you understand it at an intuitive level, then like the sky's the limit. So, Dart has been around since like 2011, 2012. It's been, sort of like a cult language, right? There was a lot of good followers. It's being used a lot at Google, used a bit outside of Google. And so Dart around 2014 started to think about, well, where does Dart go from here, right? And I remember talking to a bunch of product managers there internally at Google at their offices, and they said to me, we know Dart has a future. We just need to figure out the right future for Dart because there are a lot of options. And one of those options was going on mobile, and I thought they meant replacing Java with Dart. But there is a different motive there. The idea was not to replace Java with Dart. The idea was to come up with a whole new mobile framework itself. And this confused me at the start. But where this comes from is there was another team at Google. And this team's problem was whenever they told their developers to build apps, the developers said, cool, it will take 6 weeks, for example. And they said, why? They said, well, we got to do it for Android, then we got to do it for iOS, then we got to do 2 times the regression testing, 2 times the translation, 2 times of everything. And Google was getting frustrated. Google likes to move fast. And so Google said, is there a better way? Right? They looked at React Native, and for various reasons, React Native was not the better way for Google. And I'll explain why I personally like Flutter more than React later. And so they said, well, let's see how we can build mobile apps in a better way. If you look at history, if you were using the computer in 2000, you might have run across a tool called Flash Player, right? And almost everyone used Flash Player. Right? And it was a way for you to write ActionScript and have it run on Windows and Mac and Linux. And Google was very inspired by this idea. It's not a new idea. Flash Player, all it did was it ensured Adobe, or Macromedia at that time, ensured that Flash ran perfectly on the operating system. All you had to worry about was making sure your ActionScript was perfect, right? ActionScript was the way to write Flash apps. And Adobe and Macromedia did the rest. So in a similar idea, Google ensures that the Flutter rendering engine will run everywhere, Android, iOS, and it's up to you to write good Flutter code, right? And they used a rendering engine that has been proven to be very effective. And that rendering engine is a very small, obsolete engine called Google Chrome, right? Technically, it's Skia, but Flutter is not a web app. What they did was they took Chrome and they got rid of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, browser, everything right down to the rendering engine level, which is called the Skia rendering engine. And they said, okay, we now have a rendering engine that can draw pixels to the screen. Now, if we take Dart and we start writing some Dart code, we can actually start drawing shapes on the screen. And if we build enough framework by looking back at 10 years of learnings in how mobile apps are built, we can build a framework where developers can build mobile apps very quickly. And that's how Flutter was born, right? Flutter's code name was called Sky. And so with this concept, Flutter team released Sky beta, and then it announced Flutter, and it took off, right? Like Flutter is absolutely growing. It's growing like wildfire. And so, at a high level, this is how Flutter works. There's the material design UI set, widget set. There's also a Cupertino widget set. There's a bunch of widgets itself. So if you don't like material design or Cupertino, which is Apple's design language, you can design your own, right? You can design like Faisal's cool design language. Then you have something called rendering, which is just figuring out how everything looks on the screen, animation, painting, gestures, and services. We'll talk about services in a second. After that, you have all the computer science stuff, which is like compiler and VM and memory management, all that stuff. Stuff that doesn't really concern you, but if you want to learn more about it, it's all available on flutter.dev. So, at a high level, Flutter's entire goal is 60 frames per second, native Android and iOS, fast, beautiful, natural. Fast just means 60 frames per second, really fast code. Beautiful means that it's subjective. However, it means material design or Cupertino. And then you have natural. And what natural means is, doesn't matter where your app is running, it's going to behave like that platform, right? So if you run your app on Android, it's going to behave like an Android app. The physics, the way users interact with your app, the glows are going to feel like an Android app. If you do it on iOS, the physics, the glows, the bounciness of iOS, the animations are going to be like an iOS app. You just have to write code. You don't have to write iOS-specific code, Android-specific code. You're writing Flutter code, and it's going to automatically write it to the screen, right? One code base, multiple platforms. So when this coffee company came to me and they said, build it, I said, all right, I'll charge you a lot of money, but I'll build it. And I looked at their code base and I said, oh man, how am I going to do this in 2 months? Because there's so much business logic. And I don't want to rewrite all this business logic in Dart and then do all the UI. Like, what if I write something wrong, right? I'm going to end up delaying this project. But I said, you know what? There's actually a better way of doing it. And so I wrote down a framework and I said, okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to audit the code base. I'm going to make sure that it's actually possible to rewrite this into Dart, right? And what I mean by possible is, are they using something so esoteric, something so bizarre that I just can't copy into Dart, right? For example, an example would be one of their requirements would be that it must run on Android 1.0, right? Flutter doesn't work on Android 1.0, so I just wouldn't be able to do it. So I did stuff like this. I talked about future roadmap. Imagine in the future they were going to say, well, right now we support Android 5, but we want to launch in an emerging market where it supports Android 3.0, right? Flutter's out of the question again. So I spoke to a few stakeholders. I figured out the OS requirements. I figured out any database requirements. Like, are they using something so weird that I just can't use in Flutter, right? Which is very rare, if not impossible. And I'll tell you why. But, none of this was coming up. So I said, sounds good. My code base, fantastic. Now, The next part was plugins, right? So I just want to go back here. Audit your code base, create plugins, handle user migration, analytics screen migration, and doing the UI last. The first four things took me a month out of the 2 months, right? So half my time was spent doing the first four things, right? And I'll tell you why. I left the UI till the very end because UI in Flutter is rarely ever the blocker. What is always the blocker is the business logic part, connecting to APIs and all of that stuff, right? You get stuck with OAuth nonsense, you get stuck with weird issues with JSON. And so I said, no, I'm going to do the UI at the very end. I'm going to deal with the meaty part at the start. And so I dealt with auditing my code base within a couple days. This is where I spent at least 2 weeks. They had a lot of business logic, right? And when I mean a lot, I mean 3 years worth of business logic, right? Tons of code, tons of weird stuff happening. And that made me very uncomfortable. Yes, I can open it up on the screen and side by side translate it into Dart, but I don't know what's happening. And they don't have developers anymore. They're telling me what's happening. So what I said was, okay, I'm going to actually extract all the business logic, like literally copy and paste the Kotlin code and the Objective-C code into separate files. Make sure there's no other dependencies. Just copy and paste it, and add a plugin on top that Flutter can talk to the business logic. This way, I don't rewrite business logic. The code is exactly what it is in production right now, and I'm giving it a Flutter facelift, basically, right? All that business logic. And so I spent 3 weeks doing this, almost 2 or 3 weeks, where I said, okay, let's copy over the business logic for X or Y or Z. And I did it on Objective-C, I did it on iOS, I did it on Android. And after that, was working fantastic, right? So if you have a lot of business logic, consider deferring rewriting it to Dart till after you've launched, and just copy that business logic over and start creating a plugin. This will help you slowly transition into Dart, where what I started doing post-launch was I said, okay, the first three methods that we were calling a service, let's now instead of calling the native layer, let's just build that directly into Dart. Now that I know how the app works fine and all the business logic is working, I have a lot more time, right? I don't have this time constraint of 2 months, I got to get it done. Now, look at third parties that don't have Flutter libraries, right? Create a plugin. So one example was they were using a library for geolocation. There's no such library that track the user's location if they entered a store that exists on Flutter. So I took that and I made it a plugin and I pushed it on Pub, right? So you can do stuff like this. You can give back to the community as well. So after that, I said, okay, this I accidentally left till the very end and it bit me later. But the idea was when the user finally upgrades their Android and iOS app to this Flutter app, we don't want them to log out, right? For Flutter, because you're not dealing with core data and SQLite anymore, your Flutter app will not know if the user's logged in or not. So what I did was, again, I built a plugin and I sucked up all the data from core data and SQLite into my Flutter app, right? And I use a library in Flutter called Hive. And that helped me very easily migrate a user and keep them logged in, right? All their auth keys and everything came into the Flutter world, basically. And I was able to use that to make authentication requests and everything that I was using API access for. This thing was also extremely annoying. Analytics migration. Your Android and iOS apps will have different screen names and paths users follow. If you look at an Android app or an iOS app, say we're talking about Netflix, right? You open up Netflix, you browse the movie, you click on it, it all goes to the details page, and you click play, and it opens up the video. You can implement that on Android as 3 activities. You can implement it on Android as 3 fragments, or even a view pager. Same thing with Flutter. You can have 3 different navigations, or actually one widget that's turning stuff on or off. Though to the user, optically, it's exactly the same. But from the code perspective, it's a very different flow. And so when we launched the app, people were able to buy coffee, but their analytics guy messaged me and he said, "It looks like your analytics aren't working or the Flutter app's broken." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, we're getting sales, so I don't think it's the Flutter app, but somehow the user is starting the flow and suddenly purchasing. He's somehow missing like these three other screens, right?" And that's when I realized that even though I have analytics in my app and it's automatically tracking because Firebase automatically tracks the screens, it's not tracking the correct flows. So I had to manually go in and fake a bunch of stuff to match up with their existing analytics. So, and I couldn't just tell them to switch over because they have legacy, like 3 years worth of analytics data. The other thing was, going back to libraries that Flutter doesn't support, in the first part, which is auditing your code base, this company uses a very specific Google Analytics library called Enhanced Ecom, and Flutter does not support it. There's no library for Flutter. It's not that it doesn't support it, there's no library. Google has a Google Analytics API and a Firebase Analytics API, but not for enhanced e-commerce. So, I was delayed by a week. I had to go make a plugin for that. So the point is, you can do everything in Flutter that you can do in your Android and iOS app, but sometimes you'll just have to do some extra work to bring over those old legacy stuff that no one's really done in Flutter yet, or no one supports anymore. Like Google doesn't support enhancement e-commerce, but this company still needs it because it drives their BI tools or whatever. So keep that in mind. Lastly, like I said, to the UI last, right? Almost every UI can be rebuilt in Flutter. UI is never going to be your bottleneck. So take this time, I guess, to talk to your designer. And that's what I did. I messaged their designer and I said, "Hey, designer, I have still like a month before I start on the UI. I have a bunch of backend stuff to do. So Flutter lets you actually implement the vision that you've always wanted, right? So go through the mocks for the apps and think about if you would have changed anything. The sacrifices you made on Android and iOS, you don't have to do on Flutter anymore because the animation framework is so rich, the widget set's so rich, right? So go wild." And the designer did tweak like at least like 5% of the app and came back to me and said, here, can you do an animation here that I always wanted, a ripple animation when they check out and all that stuff? And we were able to do it. So, while you're porting your application, the back end and doing all the business logic and stuff, maybe get your designer to do a new, fresh coat of paint on the app. Lastly, when it comes time to finally deploy your application, roll it out slowly. You will always run into issues. In fact, I still run into some issues regarding some Kotlin code, but that's just a bug in the original code base, right? But roll it out slowly and preferably on Android first, because it's easy to push out Android updates. They take like 3-4 hours to update versus iOS, which is like 2 days sometimes. And so push it out slowly on Android, let it trickle out, test the app out. If everything works, then your Android business logic that you ported over, as well as the Flutter UI code is solid. That way, when you push it out to iOS, you don't have to worry about if your Flutter UI, Flutter code is going to work. You just have to make sure that your Objective-C code or Swift code that you made into a plugin doesn't have any issues, right? So you reduce the problem vector space by a lot. Problem surface area, not vector space, problem surface area by a lot. So when you do that, you'll find bugs pop up. You pay close attention to Crashlytics. It's going to be super useful. And I think it's probably the best tool right now to track bugs on Flutter. With that, I want to say if you're an Android developer right now looking to learn Flutter, go to flutter.io or flutter.dev, getting started, Flutter for Android developers. And this is a documentation that I wrote a couple years ago that's been updated by a lot of other people. And the whole idea is, I am an Android developer. How do I translate that entire concept to Flutter, right? So what's an activity in Flutter? What's a view in Flutter? What's an intent in Flutter? If you're an iOS developer, it's the exact same thing. What's a UI view controller in Flutter? How do I, what's a storyboard in Flutter? All that stuff. Lastly, if you're a web developer, similar things, not exactly, because web and Flutter are so different. The whole idea is, how do I style components in Flutter? How do I do layouts in Flutter? Stuff like that. And so with that, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to say thank you for listening. And if you have any questions about Flutter, please post it in the chat or email me at faisalabid@gmail.com or tweet out to me at faisalabid. And, if any questions, I'll check in the private chat. Sometimes I get this question a lot and I'll answer it, before someone writes it, which is, what is the difference between React Native and Flutter, right? And at a high level, they seem the same, right? They're both cross-platform libraries. But at a deeper level, what you see is React Native takes your React Native codes and emits a native Android button or a native iOS button. The problem with that is on Android, there's so many different variations of Android devices that you still have to test a lot on. Okay, someone asked another question. So I'll get to that anyway. So you have to do a lot of testing as well. On Flutter, you know that if your app looks good and works on any device, it's going to look the same and behave the same on any other device because the rendering engine is what driving it. So it's up to Google to make sure the rendering engine works fine. And Google then is doing all the testing on all the devices. Google has a couple dollars to buy every single device on Earth, right? So they're doing a lot of testing there. And then your app will work the same and look the same on every device. How do you rate the stability of Flutter Web? Flutter Web is beta right now. If you ask me, I'm not optimistic about the stability as of today. It's good. I would rate it 6 out of 10. I will be very optimistic in the next couple months as there are more updates, where I would probably rate the stability 8 or 9. But to be honest, if I were you, I would wait till next summer to really build a Flutter Web production app. Also, do you recommend any design resources for developing Apple Watches through Flutter? There are minimal resources about this. Yeah, there's a lot of people asking about this. There's actually a GitHub issue. Not many people are doing this. So a Flutter Apple Watch. There is a GitHub issue that's talking about this, as well as an article on Flutter. I didn't actually know they had an article now. Adding an Apple Watch extension, you can do it this way. But there is a GitHub issue here, right here. Flutter support for Apple Watch. I recommend you go through this. It's a long issue, and it talks about what are the pros and cons and the difficulties in using Flutter for Apple Watch. To be honest, if I was building an Apple Watch app only, I would just stick with using Objective-C or Swift, right? There's no reason for me to use Flutter because I can't reuse that code anyways on Android. Cool. I also want to talk about the feedback/quiz form. There's some prizes, so be sure to fill that out, and you might win a prize. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you what the prize is, but it's a pretty cool prize. Oh, no, actually, I read it there. It's Google Home Mini. Cool, so everyone does know. With that, if there's any other questions, let me know. If not, feel free to email me or send me a tweet, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Cool. I don't think there's any more questions.